The story of Esther is a remarkable one, a story of how one person found the courage to stand up for her community, knowing full well that it might cost her her life. I'm going to encourage you to go home and read the whole book because it's kind of hard to get a sense of the story with just a few of the verses we had read today. But I want to summarize Esther as best I can and then get to the point where we were today in the reading. So I want you to picture we're in ancient Persia. The Jews have been taken as slaves in Babylon. They are strangers in a foreign land, and they're living under constant threat for their lives. So in the first chapter of Esther, we learn that the Queen Vashti, had refused to come to the king's dinner party. And the king is furious. And he consults his legal experts about what to do with this audacious behavior. And those legal experts say that he should banish Vashti. They accuse her of causing the women in the kingdom, this is in the Bible, to look with contempt on their husbands. You don't want to do that. So she's banished. And now it's time to replace the queen. And so they gather all the beautiful young virgins of the kingdom together, and they're brought to the king, and they expect that from that group, the king's going to choose a new queen. And among those women is Esther, one of the many Jews living in Persia. She's been adopted by her uncle Mordecai, and we learn that she is beautiful and fair, and she's the chosen one by the king. But he doesn't know that she's Jewish. And Uncle Mordecai tells her to keep silent about her identity. Meantime, Uncle Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, and he overhears a plot to assassinate the king. And so Mordecai tells his niece Esther, and Esther tells the king in the name of Mordecai about this plot. And the plotters are hanged, and Mordecai is deemed a hero by the king. And it's written down in the chronicles of the king's records about this event. And now the story takes another twist. Haman is promoted to be the king's second in command because of this assassination plot. And Haman demands that everyone bow down to him. But Mordecai refuses to bow down because Mordecai will only bow to God and refuses to bow down to a human being. Now Haman is ticked off because his authority is challenged. And when Haman discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, then Haman is going to plot his revenge. And Haman feeds on the fears that the Jews were not like us, that their traditions and customs would be a threat to the king's power. And so he convinces the king of what we've known so many times over the years with our Jewish friends as a final solution. He makes his case to the king. He says there are these people, they're scattered throughout the kingdom, and their laws are different from our laws. Their laws are different from the king's laws. It's not appropriate for you, O king, to tolerate them. They are not us. The security of the kingdom is threatened by their presence. And so this decree goes out to all the Jews in all the Persian provinces would be killed. And the law was signed. And for all purposes, it was over for the Jews. Young and old, women and children, all to be killed in one day. Mordecai learns of this, and he goes through the city weeping and wailing and ripping his clothes, and then he goes to the king's gate. And he gets Esther's maids to tell her what is going on. And they return to Esther, and they tell Esther about this plot to destroy all the Jews. And Mordecai pleads with Esther to do something to save her people. She may be the only way they will survive. And Mordecai, who had once advised Esther to be silent, to not reveal her Jewish identity, tells her that now the time for silence is over. And Mordecai pleads with Esther to save her people. And the most famous words probably in the whole book are the ones that he shares in chapter 4. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Esther is afraid. She lies awake, tossing and turning for 3 nights. I imagine what's going through her head. She's only one person. She's a woman. She's Jewish. She knows that if she goes before the king, first of all, he'll be angry because nobody just goes to the king. But what's going to happen when she reveals her identity? And so she says, if I die, I shall die. She calls on her people to fast and to pray, and she musters up the courage to go to the king. And at first he's angry with her, but then he says, what is your request? And what we read today from the book of Esther takes place at the queen's banquet. Esther has asked the king and Haman to join her for a dinner, for a banquet that she will prepare. No problem. Haman's really excited about this because he's getting to dine with the king. And Esther is filled with pride that she has been able to think about this. But then Haman comes to the dinner. And on his way to the king's dinner, he sees Mordecai at the gate. And Mordecai still refuses to bow to him. And he gets so filled with rage that he orders that these gallows be built to hang Mordecai. And he plans to get the king's approval to hang Mordecai the next morning so that everything can be all taken care of, so that when he goes to the banquet, he can just eat, drink, and be merry. But that same night, the king can't sleep. He orders the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought to him and to be read. And the book was turned to the day when Mordecai exposed the plot to assassinate the king. And the king realizes that he never properly thanked Mordecai. So as Haman arrives the next morning to ask that Mordecai be hanged, the king asks Haman for his advice. He asks Haman on how he might be able to honor someone. And Haman, in his pride, thinks this is about him. He's imagining being honored by the king, the adoring crowds, the cheers. So imagine Haman's shock when the king says, go at once and go get that Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, so that I may honor him. And Haman obeys the king, but he sure is not happy. He's humiliated. And now he must go to the banquet, to the dinner with the king and the queen. And there Esther claims her identity as a part of the Jewish people and begs the king to save her people. She will no longer live in secret about her identity. If you exterminate the Jews, my king, you will be exterminating me along with them. When I think about the king making this decision, it becomes personal, doesn't it? It's much harder to go around annihilating those people that we know and that we love. There's something about the face-to-face, the getting to know one another in friendship and relationship. And so one of the king's attendants tells the king that Haman had built these gallows to kill Mordecai. And the king is so furious with Haman that he orders that Haman be the one that's hung. Haman's cruelty led to his own destruction, and the brave young Esther led to the salvation of her people. The story ends with what we know as the Feast of Purim. It's a feast that our Jewish friends to this day celebrate about the survival, yet again, of their people in a foreign land. The Purim is filled with all kinds of fun and games and wearing weird hats and doing all kinds of things as they laugh in the midst of being saved once again. When we look at Esther through the lens of our own experiences and lives as people of God, we see a young woman who, despite her fears, was daring enough to stand in the face of power. Esther's plans for the banquet weren't about being some good little wife planning a nice little dinner party. She knew exactly what she was doing in risking her life to stand before the king. And when the story of Esther is told today in synagogues and churches all over the world, Esther is remembered because she had courage and she had the integrity to stand up in the presence of the king and blow the whistle on the villain Haman. Esther found the courage to do what was right, She dared to go against the political and social system of her day, and she risked her very life for her convictions. Aren't there moments and days when you may feel like those ancient Jews living in a foreign land where it is so challenging and difficult to live what we believe and value? Isn't it a challenge to live in a culture that defines you as something other than a beloved child of God? Aren't there days when you wish you could reveal your true identity without fear of being annihilated, if nothing else, in spirit? Where might we be in such a time as this? Where might we be called upon to act, to speak words of truth to power, to stand up for what is right, because we still face the values of empire and kingdom, powers that seek to crush people, powers that seek to annihilate them, powers that seek to make people go away? Where might you and I be in such a time as this? Esther didn't wake up one day and say, oh, someday I'm going to be a heroine and save my people, and a feast will be celebrated in my honor. You know, what makes this story so powerful for me is that there was a time when she felt like she had to take the risk, and she did it. She did it at the peril of her own life. And it makes me think there are times when we're called to take risks. And we may not be in a position of power or in the midst of power, but we may be in a place where someone or some group's voice is being silenced, and we're called to speak out. We may be journeying along the road as the disciples were, and we see God's children being mistreated. Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa has said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. How do we speak up? How do we stand up for who we are and what we believe? Esther could have kept silent, but she didn't. We are part of a denomination in the United Church of Christ that has for years and years and years stood up with those who are oppressed. We are part of a church tradition that has been a voice for those whose voices have been silenced. Long time ago, when trains used to take toxic waste and open up a little valve and let that toxic waste fall along the railroad tracks through West Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, lots of people knew that this was happening. But no one took that on as a project to say, this is wrong to be polluting the land where some of the poorest people in our nation were living. The United Church of Christ did that in the 1970s. It was a landmark case. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. We were the voice for those whose voices had been ignored and silenced. We could go time and time again in issue after issue after issue where we have sought to be a voice and to stand with our neighbors in need. This congregation shares that tradition. A lot of you were around 40 years ago when, under the leadership of Pastor Wenner and others in the congregation, this church spoke truth about what was happening to the homeless folks in our community. And we were part of the beginning of what we now know as the Religious Coalition. People thought those folks would just go away if you didn't talk to them or talk about them. But that's not what we do for God's beloved children. Our congregation has spoken out against cuts in budgets that harm nonprofits that serve the most vulnerable in our community. We have stood with and spoke for those who teach and work in our public schools, because education ought to be available for all, and it ought to be fair and just. We've stood on the steps of our church time after time in solidarity with victims of violence, and we've walked the halls of Annapolis and Washington, D.C. to advocate for justice. And on Thursday, we held an event in our new community room, and I was really excited that the first public education event was one about how to have dialogue and conversation with each other in these difficult days. Over 80 people were present throughout the day as we listened to our presenter and practiced ways of understanding what makes our conversations difficult and how we can overcome our human tendency